So this teaching has everything to do with us as human beings. And I want to emphasize that up front, that I do think, it's my experience with myself very much, but also I think with how sometimes when we're so tangled up in our personal struggles and we have our problems, then we tend to think, oh, this is me and my problem. And uh, there can even be an assumption that we're particularly problematic. Does anyone have that feeling like, geez, I'm particularly problematic? Like other people are basically fine, but me, no, I'm not fine. And I think we tend to overestimate how much of our problems we as persons are creating. I say something like 90% of what we're experiencing as suffering, even our personal suffering, is actually created just by us being human beings. I mean, the basic structures of what dukkha is something that has to do with being human. And then a certain percentage has to do with being American or German or Swiss or whatever. So there's some cultural element in our particular suffering. And then there's some biographical element. But that's the last bit. And what we're finding in Buddhist practice is that once we get through the biographical hypnosis that we're in, or the biographical layers, oftentimes we're finding cultural dimensions. And once we get through those, oftentimes, or always, we're finding something that has to do just with what kind of species we are, what kind of organism we are. And dukkha, etymologically, actually means, it's a Sanskrit word, and it means the ka is the center of an axis. Some of you know that, I know, but it's the center of an axis, right? And du is when like in a wheel, when the axis is off. So something is off center. That's dukkha. And the opposite of that is sukha. And that's when the axis is centered in the wheel. So very simply, and again, just as the starting point for our practice, what we want to sensitize ourselves, and that does take a certain amount of the discipline to really become very intimate with your own experience, is to notice when you're off center. And the 5 F's are off center type responses, stress. And they are survival responses. They are optimized for survival. They are not optimized for dealing with the truth of impermanence, interdependence, and just the mystery of our existence. They are not optimized for ethics. And they are not optimized for truth. But anyways, we have these brains that are optimized in a certain way. And what our brain does is it creates this particular way that we can be in the world, that Baker Roshi he creates these terms that then they mean something very specific. So he calls consciousness basically our waking state of mind. Other people use that word differently, but I'm going to use it in Baker Roshi's terminology now. And how it's defined is it's that which makes the world predictable, relatively predictable. It externalizes the world. It creates this feeling of out there-ness. And then it does the meanest thing of all. It makes itself invisible. Like, in other words, we're looking at what we're looking at, and nothing tells us that it's our mind that we're seeing. we think we're seeing the world, but we're not. I mean, even within the same culture and within the same species, like you guys are sitting really close to each other and you actually have a very similar background, Laurie and Nico here. But still, your experience of this moment is unique. You're experiencing it in the Nico way, you're experiencing it in the Laurie way. Consciousness and just the kind of species we are, being optimized for survival, consciousness does these three things. It puts the world out there, seemingly out there. It makes it relatively predictable. And then it makes itself invisible. Now, that is not just a really great way that we can survive better, but unfortunately, the byproduct of that is what we call dukkha. It is like, I mean, from a simplified, I'm trying to simplify right now, right? So from that simplified perspective, I think there's really basically two questions in Buddhism. One is, what is it that turns sukha into dukkha? Like, why does that even happen? Why does the axis ever get off center? What is it that pulls sukha into dukkha? And what is it that can transform dukkha back into sukha? Those are the two basic questions. And so if we need to solve those questions within ourselves. Now, the Buddha himself, he called these three forces that do that pull the axis off center. He called them, well, he had Sanskrit words for them, but they are oftentimes translated as greed, hate, and delusion. I like to look more at the basic dynamics of them because these are very strong words. And I think, but the actual dynamic of these three forces, though, is much more subtle than, full-fledged greed and hatred and so forth. The core of greed, I would say, it's like just this basic inclination to want to, like, me first, a kind of me first movement. Make me great again. Me first movement. Sorry. I do that. So that kind of feeling, me first. Now, if you're gonna optimize an organism for survival, you would want it to say me first. And then there's, instead of hatred, I again put it more subtly, it's othering. Oh, that's not me. That's other. That kind of separation where we're othering others. Yeah. And then the third, delusion, I would say is various things, but it's every time that we don't see how to locate ourselves in a fundamentally relational world in which me is not exactly first. It's just everything is a version of me, and so we're taking care of everything all at once. But I'm also part of that larger me-ness. I mean, in a technical way, I would say it's when we deny the truth of impermanence and the truth of interdependence. That would be the basic definition of delusion. Okay, so now then again, the craft is in moments of dukkha. How do we bring our own reactions, our own experience, our own impulses, our thinking and feeling? How do we bring that back into that place where we're not pulled off center? And yeah, I guess the last thing I just want to say before sending you guys into your own exploration is that you may know this, but it's always, I think, good to remind. In this practice, suffering and happiness are not really on the same spectrum that they are in our usual use of those words. Usually we would think, I think of suffering as negative experiences, right? And then there are more positive experiences and they are happiness. That's usually how we would think of it. So there's a spectrum from really, really terrible experiences to great experiences. And on that spectrum, there are a number of words for it, but like on that end of the spectrum is negative suffering experiences, and on that end is positive or happy experiences. In Buddhism, that's not the spectrum. In Buddhism, the spectrum is that of attachment. So dukkha is a dynamic of attachment and not of negative experience. As we always say, is pain is inevitable. That's negative experience. But suffering is optional. Well, how can that be? Don't I automatically suffer from pain? And again, the Buddhist answer is no, you don't. It's when you're attaching to not having that pain, or when you're resisting that pain, or you're attaching to something that's not there. So like I always do that in a very simple thought experiment. And I get like usually 3 times per day, I get to enact that thought experiment. I really like chocolate. And if there's chocolate in front of me, oh, by the way, Baker Roshi, I ate up your chocolate. So, like, if there's chocolate on a table, I go, me first, right? So, that the impulse arises, I want that chocolate. That is, from my understanding of how this dynamic works and what creates suffering, like what really creates dukkha. And let me not call it suffering, but let me here now call it dukkha. What creates dukkha? In my understanding, it's not that the impulse arises, I want that. The arising of the impulse does not create dukkha. And that is one of the ways in which, at least I'm seeing, at least in Western Buddhism, we can create a kind of spiritual dissociation where we're trying to cut off those impulses. I shouldn't want that. But then we're cutting ourselves off from our basic aliveness. So that the impulse arises is not dukkha. Also, even to eat the chocolate is also not dukkha. I mean, at some point it starts being dukkha, but that in itself is not. But what dukkha is, the combination of the impulse arises. And then there is no choice, but I have to take it. And if I can't have it, then I'm going to get angry, for example. Like I won't accept not having it. Now that is impulse plus attachment plus or within an unreflected, choiceless situation. So you want to bring in order to break dukkha, you want to bring in 2 aspects here. You want to bring in choice. The impulse arises and you want to, first of all, again, and like anchor yourself, welcome the impulse, activate your deeper intentions. And sometimes my deeper intentions have everything to do with chocolate, but sometimes they don't. So you bring yourself back into the basic dynamics of practice and create choice. So you want to bring in choice. I don't have to do this, but I could. And by bringing in choice, you're also bringing in the space that's like where it's not automatic. It's those that's the dynamic that would break dukkha.